The autumn wind ran the length of Main Street and left a smell of wood smoke behind. Wagons creaked. A bell rang somewhere, and a dog barked like he owned the road. Independence, Missouri, 1847. Busy enough to forget itself, until laughter snapped the air wrong. 3 men had Martha back to the water trough with a basket hugged against her chest. Laundry, white shirts, aprons, a blue ribbon that had slipped free and darkened in the mud. She stood straight anyway. She said, "Please, let me pass." Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. "That's a toll street," the tall one said. "You pay by the pound." Their friends laughed the way men do when they think nobody will stop them. Inside the trading post, Silas Blackwood set down a tin of caps and a length of lampwick and listened. Cruelty has a sound, a wet kind of happiness. He pushed the door so hard it kissed the wall, and the room outside paused to measure him. 6'4", river-wide shoulders, the wear of 20 winters in his face, and the steadiness of 20 winters in his hands. "The lady asked you to let her pass," he said. "Calm. Seems reasonable." "Mountain man," the tall one smirked. "Head back to your hole." Silas walked. Sand crunched. The knife on his belt didn't move. The eyes did. "Step aside," he said. "Now." The stocky one squared himself. "You'll fight 3 of us over a washerwoman?" Martha bent to gather what had fallen. Muddy lace. A damp apron. That blue ribbon dragged like a small river behind it. Her fingers shook, but kept working. The way she tried to save what wasn't hers to lose. That's what did it. "Leave that poor woman alone," Silas said, and his voice didn't rise so much as deepen. It carried. Doors breathed open. Boots stopped. The dog went quiet first. The tall one drew a knife, because that's what tall fools do. Silas didn't argue. He stepped off the line, caught the wrist, turned like a page, and let the metal fall. A short, square punch met a jaw that wasn't ready. The man went to sleep cleanly, as if the ground had asked him to lie down and he obliged. The other 2 came together and tripped over the idea. The stocky one swung. Silas caught the fist in his palm and dropped a knuckle into the soft breath place under the ribs. Air left. So did pride. The young one, more boy than man, snatched a wagon slat and made a circle with it that didn't have a center. Silas slipped inside the circle, took a fistful of shirt, lifted him until Boots thought about flying, and said, near enough that only the boy heard, "Wrong woman, wrong day." Then he put him into the trough like he was helping him choose water. The splash did the talking. 30 seconds. Maybe less. Enough time for wood smoke to find new direction. Silas turned to Martha. Up close, she was younger than fear had made her look. 26, perhaps. Brown eyes that had learned to watch doors first, people second, hair drawn back, and still trying to be neat. The laundry print had smeared her wrist like blue sky on a cloudy day. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" She shook her head. The basket creaked with her grip. He crouched, picked up the lost things, and shook what mud would let go. The blue ribbon held his fingers, bright even with street on it. He pinched it clean along his thumb, handed it back like something worth handing, and didn't let the crowd decide what mattered. "Thank you," she said, scarcely louder than the old dog's breath. "I thank you. No need." He looked at the heap of men learning to breathe again. "I expect they'll remember their manners now." He offered to walk her 2 streets over, because trouble has cousins. She nodded once and led, shoulders high, chin lower, basket tight. The people watching did what towns do. They tried to pack the moment away under talk. Talk is light. Solid acts are heavy. The street favored the heavy today. If you've ever watched a room go silent for the right reason, the wind seemed to say as it braided itself with leaves and smoke, "Stay with me." They took a left where a cooper's hammer set the pace of the corner. They passed a window where Cinnamon argued with Coffee about which could be kinder. The boarding house wore fresh paint in window boxes, and that meant someone inside had made decisions no one could push around. Mr. Blackwood. Martha said at the step, voice steadier, "I want you to know, people don't often." She searched for a word that wasn't bother, pity, or laugh. "Stand." "They should," he said. "You deserve it same as anyone." Tears moved in her eyes but didn't spill. Relief has its own shine. Inside, Mrs. Cartwright proved built of exactly what her porch promised. No nonsense, clean aprons, sharp eyes that cut only what needed cutting. She heard the story in one breath and named the men in the next. Those Miller boys again, high-spirited, says the marshal. I say their spirits need lowering. Pie, she decided as of a verdict. Coffee. Sit. Silas sat because refusal would insult not just a woman, but her house. Apple pie carried autumn like a good memory. Martha returned with her sleeves washed and her eyes calmer. They talked about gardens, how a creek can be a root's best friend and worst enemy, about books, adventures she borrowed a page at a time because pages cost, about mornings that start before light because work is a faithful clock. Silas wasn't a talker by trade, but quiet men know good ground when they feel underfoot, and this was good ground. He told her about winter sky that snaps and summer meadows too bright to argue with, about learning to read avalanches the way some men read newspapers, about the first time loneliness felt heavier than a full pack. Martha listened like she was holding a candle out for him to see by. When he rose to leave, she reached the door first and held it for him. It felt like a small ceremony nobody named. Will you come back? She asked, and her cheeks confessed to asking. I will, he said, and that surprised him only because it had been a while since he wanted to be anywhere 2 days in a row. He did come back. Morning turned on its heel and found him there by afternoon. The second visit had fewer careful pauses, and more laughter breathed into the spaces between sentences. On the third, they sat in the narrow garden where the window boxes learned what the yard already knew. Martha could coax life from stubborn soil. He watched her mend with neat, firm stitches and thought about the blue ribbon now washed and dry on a line like a shy flag. He thought about symbols, how some are bought, some are given, and some are simply found in the mud and made clean again. That was when the idea stood up inside him. A cabin that had one chair too many for a single man, a creek that asked for careful hands, a stretch of ground that would serve a garden if someone loved it enough. The thought didn't rush. It arrived the way snow does, soft, and then all at once you notice the world is different. Would you walk the ridge with me tomorrow? He asked instead of saying all of it. I'll show you where the herbs hide and how the wind tells stories. She looked at him like he'd offered a map no one else knew existed. I have chores, she said automatically, because habit answers first. Then, I could rise earlier. Morning put frost on the watering trough and left the street board slick as peeled apples. Independence woke to the news the way towns do. Fast where it shouldn't, slow where it should. 3 men had gone to ground under one man's hands, and the woman they picked was seen walking away with her basket high. A blue ribbon clean again and bright enough to argue with the cold. By noon, the story had split into 3 versions. In one, told at the smithy with sparks for punctuation, Silas Blackwood was a storm that happened to pass through. In another, poured across a saloon counter with rye, he was a brute who liked to show off. In the third, whispered between needle pricks at Mrs. Prohl's dressmaking table, he was exactly what Martha needed at the exact hour she needed it, and if Providence wore buckskin sometimes, who were they to complain? The Miller boys limped themselves into courage and called it bad luck. People nodded because it cost nothing to nod. But nods changed nothing, and the bruises felt like a promise coming due. At the boarding house, Mrs. Cartwright set her jaw and set extra plates, too, because that's how she fought, by making a table where people could be steadied. Martha worked with the quiet speed of someone who knows the morning rush like a dance. She stacked cups 3 to a hand, wiped, refilled, and kept the room warm without a word. Now and then, her fingers found a ribbon tied at her wrist, blue on brown skin, a line of color you could follow out of a long tunnel. Sugar? She asked a traveling preacher who liked his coffee like he liked his sermons, dark and impatient. He peered at the ribbon and decided the town would do well to talk about other people's souls less and their own more. He didn't say it out loud. Not yet. Silas pushed the door late in the morning. He had brought winter carrots tucked in a sack and news in his eyes. Outside, a pair of boys were sliding booth heels across the frosted plank to see who could fall first without crying. Inside, an iron stove hummed the one note that says, "You're safe enough to swallow." "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Cartwright said, and the room took its cue from her tone, respectful, not fawning. "You brought something, or you're letting me feed you again?" "Both," he said, and set the carrots down as if they were a bouquet. He took a seat at a corner table, because corners let a man watch the whole without asking for it. Martha came with coffee, and the look between them wasn't the sort gossip can use. It was plainer, and therefore stronger, like good bread, like water. "Garden love those," she said to the carrots. "Come spring." "Spring listens to people like you," he said. "It owes me nothing." They didn't speak of yesterday's fight. Some things are finished well enough by being finished. But towns love an encore, and right on cue, two men who carried a marshal's favored way mongrels carry borrowed bones shouldered in. They were not the marshal. They were men who fetched for him when he was tired of standing. Their coats tried to pretend they were uniforms. Their eyes told the truth. "Blackwood," said the one with cheeks shaved too close for the weather, "you can't go around laying men out in the street." "I can if they earn it," Silas said. And they did. Still, the second one tried. You can't have women cornered in your streets." Mrs. Cartwright set a plate, so hard the fork jumped. "The day you come in here and tell me you're fixing, that is the day I hear you about anything else." The men decided to study their boots. People finished chewing. Nobody left a tip for them. Sometimes a town speaks without words and says something that sticks. After they slunk out, Martha took a long breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. It left her shoulders lower and her voice softer when she said, "Walk with me a moment?" The sun found a corner out back. I was going to see if the rosemary survived the last cold snap. They stepped into the yard that tried to be a garden even in November. The earth had that sleeping look good ground gets when it's not dead, just thinking. The rosemary, stubborn as a mule, offered an armful of green to anyone willing to be grateful. Martha touched it and smiled like a promise keeps. "My mother called this patience," she said. "Close your eyes and breathe. It smells like meals you haven't eaten yet." Silas breathed, and the mountains in him relaxed an inch. It is a rare thing to be taught how to look forward by a plant. "My mother read to me," Martha said, voice even, "scripture, almanacs, once a book of voyages, so worn we turn it with two fingers like it might break. She said the world was wider than anything people used to measure it against me. She said," Martha's mouth held a line that was almost a laugh and almost a cut. "She said a heart is not a waistline." Silas looked at the ribbon on her wrist, so he wouldn't stare at the place where tears had considered forming and decided against it. "She sounds like she deserved a greenhouse big enough to walk through," he said, "and a town that asked her how to live. She got one of those." Martha stroked the rosemary and left it greener than she found it. "She taught me, and I'm stubborn. I keep what she taught." They stood that way, close enough to share breath in the cold, far enough not a crowd, until the kitchen bell clanged like noon had mislaid itself. Inside, the rush returned. People asked for refills, seconds, directions, news. Martha poured, carried, smiled, but her mind kept a corner aside, a small, warm room with a chair in it. It had a view of a creek she hadn't seen yet. When the plates died down to crumbs, Mrs. Cartwright leaned on the counter and chewed the end of a pencil. "Martha," she said, eyes not unkind, "those Miller boys have cousins, and cousins who need money make poor decisions. If you're walking, walk with company. I'll ask Ezekiel from the livery to be around evenings. Men who hate rules still respect a good pitchfork." "Thank you," Martha said, and meant it. Being seen is a surprise you never get used to. Silas rose. "I'll take the back alley to the mercantile," he said, which sounded like errands and was also, "I'll sweep the edges so you don't have to worry about them." He did that until the day wrung itself out and hung on the line. When he came back through the kitchen, he found Martha at the stove, stirring a pot that smelled like all the good things of autumn had decided to sit down together and agree. She had tucked the blue ribbon into her pocket, so it wouldn't catch on the handle, and the absence of it at her wrist made her look younger. Or perhaps it just made her look like herself without any explaining.
"Dawn's a fair partner," he said. Somewhere across town, the Miller boys nursed bruises and pride and began planning a worse mistake. Somewhere under the garden line, Roots decided whether to trust the colder nights. Somewhere between breath and word, a choice began writing itself in Martha's chest. The wind shifted. The dog down the block slept without turning. A candle in the boarding house window leaned a little to listen. If choice, even a small one, has ever knocked at your door so softly you almost missed it, keep listening. The sound grows if you let it.
"I've a book," she said, as if it might be contraband. "Only one that's mine." "Would you?" She hesitated. "Would you like to see it?" "Yes." She brought it like you bring a small animal from the cold. Careful, 2 hands, proud. It was a Bible. Corners rounded by years of being the one thing that goes into bag first. Between the pages, near the Psalms that talk about hills and help, she had tucked the blue ribbon as a mark. It made the thin paper look sure-footed. "My mother's," she said. "Now mine. I read it when the world is loud. Today was loud." She smiled. "I marked where it got quiet." Silas didn't take it. He didn't have to. "You don't put your hands on certain things if your respect is any good. Keep it near," he said, "and if the world gets loud again, I have a place that speaks softer." She heard what he'd said. She heard also what he had not. Her breath made a cloud, and then didn't. That night, sleep pried Martha's fingers from worry one by one. Still, she woke twice to the sound of male voices in the street. They slowed at the boarding house, then moved on. Twice. She folded the ribbon into a tighter knot and told her heart to learn a steadier pace. By morning, she found a had. The Miller boys hired 2 cousins with empty pockets and short tempers. They came to the saloon with talk that tried to be a plan. The barkeep polished the same glass long enough to make Time nervous and said, "You hear the one about a man who gives up a perfectly good day to pick a fight with a grizzly?" He wasn't brave. He was bored of having a face. The cousins laughed because fear often wears that costume. They left without a plan because the barkeep's story had already written their ending. Silas didn't slink or hide. He walked the town 3 times that day in a lazy loop that never looked like patrol, but always arrived at trouble one breath before it could call itself that. He bought nails he didn't need just to show Ezekiel a delivery that he might need a word later. He brought Mrs. Prawl some rosemary and told her it came from the hand that would be tending most of the town's glad stomachs come spring. He described the Miller boys' cousins to the preacher in words that avoided gossip and landed on responsibility. By supper, the town had done something unusual. It had decided it might like itself better tomorrow. When that happens, men who count on the worst in people lose some footing. After the plates were cleared, after the floor was sanded and the lamps trimmed, Martha took her shawl and stepped onto the back stoop. The moon had turned the yard to pewter. Her breath and the stove's breath made a braid in the air. She heard the back gate ease and didn't startle. She knew that walk now, the way weight meets board. "I should tell you something," Silas said, and leaned his shoulder to the frame so the house could carry part his words. "I've been alone a long time. The first winter I chose it. The rest it chose me. It's easy to get proud about surviving. It's harder to admit you settle for it." She didn't say anything. Silence is a gift when it is held steady. "I had a wife," he said, slowly, like memory was a track that needed finding after storm. "Long ago. Not for long. Fever is greedy. It took her. After I raised cabins and traps and the kind of thoughts a man can hold without them breaking him. I kept my hands busy so they wouldn't reach for what wasn't there." He looked at his scarred knuckles, palms up, as if checking whether they had learned anything. "Yesterday," he said, "I remembered what it felt like to stand for more than my own skin. I needed that remembering. Thank you for letting me do it without turning it into a show." She smiled because she knew the difference, being defended versus being used as a stage. "Thank you for doing it without asking for a price." He considered the moon and decided it was a fair witness. "I can show you a creek that tells the truth and a ridge where you can hear snow before it falls. I can't promise ease. I can promise work that makes sleep better. If you want to see it, only to see it's yours to see." "Not to take?" she said, to hear the shape of the boundary. "Not unless you ask for it," he said, and the boundary turned into a door. She nodded, and the nod went straight to a place inside that had been waiting for a believable invitation. "Dawn," she said, before the town remembers how to act. Dawn, he agreed. Sleep came easier for both of them, which is how you know a plan is decent. They left while the sky tried to remember blue. The frost made a delicate rattle under their boots. The road out of town lifted, then laid itself down again like a chest breathing. The hill they climbed wasn't much by mountain standards, but it was far enough from talk to sound like the truth when you spoke. The creek didn't care about yesterday. It took the long way around a rock because it wanted to, not because it was told. On its banks, wild men had made a last stand against winter. It still smelled like summer, if you asked politely. Silas showed Martha how the grasses lean where deer pass. He pressed his thumb into mud and guessed how soon it had cooled. He pointed to a hawk and said, "Watch his head, not his wings. You'll learn more from where he looks than how he flies." She gathered these things and put them where the Bible's ribbon lived, the drawer with the careful things. They climbed until the town was a rumor, and the ridge made them both silent on purpose. Up there, the wind had learned to speak in one-syllable words. Cold, clear, vast. It pushed hair into Martha's eyes and found laughter there that hadn't stretched in months. "It's big enough to swallow a person," she said, not afraid, just real. "It will," Silas said, "unless you choose your size yourself." He showed her a seam in the rock where time clung like a hymn. He touched it with the back of his hand, a quiet kind of reverence. "This grows where goats would slip," he said. "Names itself stubborn. Smells like courage." They sat on a flattish stone warmed only by the idea of sun. He told her what he hadn't told anyone in a handful of years, that sometimes, when snow wrote the world into one color, he forgot the shape of his own voice. That once he sang to keep the wolves honest and kept going because the sound taught him he was still in there. She told him what she had told no one because the telling always went wrong, that when people stared, she counted by sevens in her head until the stare passed, and then she forgave the space it left because otherwise it would take up too much room, that she'd learned where to stand in a room, so she could move without the chairs apologizing. They traded those small, hard secrets like children swapping marbles and realizing they both liked the blue ones best. On the way down, they found choke cherries still worth the risk. Their mouths puckered and then laughed at themselves, which is a fine medicine. Near the base, Silas stopped by a stand of cottonwoods and pressed his palm to a trunk. "When the wind comes to take the last leaves," he said, "you can hear the tree tell it yes. That's what surrender sounds like when it doesn't mean losing." "What does it mean?" she asked. "Making room," he said. They reached town with the sun persuading Frost to change his mind. The boarding house greeted them with steam and cinnamon again. Mrs. Cartwright took one look at their cheeks and decided some walks improved character. "Breakfast," she declared, as if she had invented it. "And you'll sit while I serve you so the neighbors can talk about my hospitality instead of yesterday's fight." They sat. People watched. The watching felt different this time, like a congregation that has decided to listen instead of be entertained. At noon, a man with sad eyes under a hat brim came to the back door while Martha peeled potatoes. He kept the brim low like he didn't trust his own face. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice tripped on the word. "I was there yesterday." Laughing, he swallowed. "I ain't proud of it. I came to say I'm sorry. I was raised better. My little sister's built like—" He panicked at the edge of the sentence and changed it mid-air. "She's built like strength. I got a man who talked about her like I talked yesterday. I forgot that. I remembered on the walk home." Martha's knife moved steady. She set it down and wiped her hands. "Thank you," she said. "Not because I needed to move on. I already moved. Thank you, because it might teach your mouth to walk with your heart next time." He lifted his brim enough to meet her eyes and nodded like a man at practice with better choices. He left a coin on the step, not as payment, but to mark the place where he'd turned around. Mrs. Cartwright found it and put it in the jar where she kept the flour money and the fund for fixing leaky roofs for widows who pretended they didn't need help. That evening, the cousins made their try. They waited behind the cooper's shop, where the alley kinks like a bad idea. They had a length of chain and the look of men who hoped a surprise could write over yesterday's lesson. Silas turned the corner, already bored of them. "No," he said, and the word was so simple it slapped the chain out of their hands. When they reached for it, he stepped on it with a boot that had hauled men out of rivers. "Try again tomorrow," he said. "And then don't." They didn't. Not because they decided virtue was fine, but because the town had shifted 1 inch toward standing up straighter, and that inch is the difference between easy and not worth it. Back at the house, Martha sat at the table with her Bible open to the blue ribbon and a sheet of paper in front of her. She was writing to no one in particular, because sometimes a page is the only friend you can be clumsy with. The letter said, "Today I tasted air that didn't belong to anyone else first." It said, "My steps fit the ground." It said, "There's a door in the sky if you know where to look, and somebody showed me the hinge." She didn't sign it. She folded it and slipped it into the back cover where her mother's handwriting lived. The ribbon touched its edge like approval. Later, in the kitchen light, Silas set a small parcel on the table wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "A thing for hands," he said, which is what men say when their hearts aren't ready to admit they're shopping for them. "Open it." Inside lay a clasp knife with a handle the color of dry wheat, and the blade ground honest, not fancy. In the handle's end, a small hole had been drilled and a thong threaded. He had tied a knot that wouldn't quit and left a loop free. "For me?" Martha asked, not to be coy, but to be sure she wasn't borrowing something she'd have to return. "For you," he said. "Not for fights. For a rope. For apples. For the thousands of small things a day asks. Tie whatever you like to the thong, so it remembers who it belongs to." She pulled the ribbon from her pocket and felt it between finger and thumb. She tied it without fuss, because fuss is a kind of apology, and she didn't know any. The knife looked like it had been waiting for that color all along. "I'll use it," she said. "I know," he answered. And the knife wasn't a gift anymore, it was a tool. Tools are the gifts that keep dignity. They stood there, both looking at the same small thing, each seeing a different large one. He saw the cabin table where it would rest, and the rope it would cut, and the fruit it would have, and the small holes it would open, and the boxes it would pry, and the letters it might someday slice the string from. She saw a different door opening. She saw herself not as the town measured her, but as a person who could weigh, decide, and carry. "You asked me to see a ridge," she said quietly. "I saw more." "What did you see?" he asked. "The part of me that stands there and doesn't apologize for taking up the sky it takes," she said. She didn't blush. The truth had too much backbone for that. He nodded like a man who recognizes a landmark the map didn't mention. The days closed their fists around the light. It thinned, then folded earlier and earlier. Martha learned the winter rhythm of a business that needs more soup and thicker bread. She learned the names of travelers by how they set their spoons down. She learned which ones would tip and which would tell a story instead, and that both were a kind of payment if you understood the math. Silas kept walking edges with his easy step that never looked like a challenge. He bought salt pork and a few things that could pass for curtains without saying the word. When the preacher came through again, Silas waited outside until the sermon ended and then said, "You have a way of talking that asks men if they're brave enough to be kind. Keep it. Only works if I'm brave enough to do it," the preacher said, surprising himself. On a Wednesday that couldn't decide if it was rain or snow, Ezekiel from the livery came with a bundle under one arm. He set it on Mrs. Cartwright's counter like he'd plucked a treasure from a wagon. Found this in a crate bound west that split. Was going to toss it. Figured better uses. "For your girl," he said, chin tipping toward Martha. "If she reads." Mrs. Cartwright unfolded the bundle and found a stack of old periodicals, Harper's, the kind with engravings of places that make a person want new boots. The top one had a map of the territories and an essay about a valley where the writer had camped and cried and lied about neither. "Mercy," Mrs. Cartwright breathed. "Martha." They spread them on the table, and the room drew in the way rooms do when they forget to pretend they have boundaries. Martha touched the engraved mountains like they were cousins and smiled at the thought that someone else had drawn the thing she had seen in her head. She tucked one issue aside, the one with the page torn just so she could fix it and feel useful. The page needed her. The feeling returned the favor. That night, the cousins packed a bag and left ahead of the winter. The Miller boys found other alleys to lurk in, and discovered most of them led back to the same cold bed. The town adjusted its shoulders. It didn't become a miracle. It became a place a person could stand a minute longer without shrinking. Sometimes that's plenty. In the quiet after, Silas took the step he'd been walking around since the ridge. He asked not with a speech, but with a sentence that had all the weight of a roof beam set right. "I would like to show you the cabin," he said. "No promises asked, none owed. Come see if your hand's like the work it offers. Come see if the creek sounds like your name." Martha looked at Mrs. Cartwright then, because courtesy is a kind of love. The older woman understood the look before the breath, following it. "You take a day and a night," she said, brisk without hiding her feelings. "I'll manage. If anyone complains, I'll feed them faster, so they forget." "Thank you," Martha said, and that gratitude had layers. For wages, for shelter, for seeing, for holding the world steady enough that a woman could take one day to decide her life without the whole house falling in. They set out at dawn that felt like an echo. The road unfurled and then folded itself behind them, as if asking them to be sure. The countryside did what countryside does. It reminded both of them that they were very small and very blessed not to be smaller. They reached the cabin by afternoon. Timbers lined like sentences that make sense. The stone chimney wore old winters well. The creek said hello the way water does, with repetition and a little dancing. Pines boxed the sky into pieces you could keep. Martha stood still and listened. She had learned that stillness doesn't equal silence. The place had a sound she could read. The sound said, labor, yes, loneliness, not if you don't want it. The sound said, bring seeds, bring books, bring parts of yourself other people call excessive, and watch them become exactly enough. Inside it smelled of pine and iron, and a life paused so it could be shared. There was a table with scars and a shelf with tin plates, and a bed that said honest sleep leaves a man heavier in the best way. In the corner stood an empty peg, and something in Martha's chest decided it was for her shawl, not because it should be, but because it could be. She put her palm flat on the table and felt last summer's meals warming today's future. "It feels like a beginning with hands," she said. Silas pointed to a wall where light fell just right in the afternoons. "If you like a shelf there," he said, "we can build it. Books shouldn't have to be moved when the stew spills." She laughed, a clear, unafraid sound. "Then we must build it. Stu and I are constant companions, and I'm not neat when the room gets busy." They walked the line where garden would be when ground loosed itself. She kneaded a clump of soil like bread and said, "You've been good to this place. It remembers." He watched her measure the sun with her eye and guessed where she'd put beans and where she let flowers start fights they'd both win. When dusk leaned against the doorframe, he lit a lamp and set it in the window. "So it can learn new faces," he said. "Houses like to be introduced." They ate biscuits and venison, and the kind of quiet that happens when two people don't compete for it. He showed her the shelf where he kept a few books he had tricked out of traders. She read the title of each aloud like she was tasting them first. So he could decide if he wanted any. He wanted all. Later, when the lamp's circle shrank to something cozy, he set a small, flat box on the table. "This is the last thing I'll give you today," he said. "It's not a nudge. It's a question that can sit for as long as you like." She opened it and found, wrapped in cloth, a plain gold band. Not new, not fancy. A ring made to be worn doing work that matters. He didn't move it closer. He didn't push the box toward her. He let it rest near the knife with the blue ribbon, and in that small tableau, a life arranged itself. Symbol and tool, promise and use. "Not tonight," he said, head bowed enough to show respect without drama. "Not this week, if you don't want. Not ever if the yes isn't yours. But if you decide the work here fits your spirit and the silence here fits your listening, I would be honored to call you partner in the ways the law knows and the heart already does." She didn't touch the ring. She ran a fingertip along the ribbon's edge instead and felt how it held. Her eyes went to window and the dark that wasn't threatening. She thought of stairs she would not have to duck under to sleep, of rooms where chairs would not have to be slid to let her pass. She thought of mornings not measured by other people's clocks, of evening bread that rose because someone sang near it. She thought of her mother's voice. "A heart is not a waistline." "I will answer you," she said, Simple as a vow and gentler. Not because I'm cornered. Because I'm finally somewhere a yes would be a real yes and a no would be a real no. He smiled. Men who have carried winter learn to smile with their eyes first. They slept in separate spaces because respect had made itself at home. He took the bed without apology because it was his, but he put his blanket by the stove in case the night wondered who was visiting. She took the bed because she was a guest, and the house agreed. Sleep came easy and woke them without fear. Morning found Martha at the creek, washing 2 cups without splashing like a child. She watched the light drop into water and come out broken into small coins. She thought, I could spend this. Not waste. Spend. The difference is a door. On the walk back to town, they did not speak much. Decisions need room to breathe if you want them to live long. Near the ridge's base, they met the preacher coming up the other way to visit a shut-in with lungs that rusted in winter. He tipped his hat and saw the choir on their faces and chose a right blessing. May your yes be yes and your no be no, he said, and may both be received with the same kindness. The next morning broke clear and thin, the kind of light that makes frost look like it's thinking. Martha ate her bread healed with honey and didn't taste the honey. Decisions, when they're honest, borrow your mouth and your feet until they're done talking. She took her ledger and her shawl, stepped out back, and sat on the stoop where the day collects itself before it walks in. On the page, she drew 3 columns, then laughed at herself for pretending choice is arithmetic. In the first, she wrote, stay. In the second, go look. In the third, a column she hadn't meant to draw at all. She wrote one word that made her hand shake a little, belong. Girl, Mrs. Cartwright called through the screen, voice mashed with the clink of cups. If you're going to make lists, at least let the coffee keep you company. Martha went inside, poured a mug, and returned to her steps. The steam uncurled something in her chest. The taste put a little patience back in her bones. She stared at the third word until it stopped being frightening and turned into something closer to a dare. Then she closed the ledger and stood. She didn't find Silas. She let him find her, carrying a crate of split would like it was an extra thought he'd picked up on the way. I've my answer, she said, and the cold took her words and made them sharper. Yes to the looking. Yes to the working. Yes to the truth you offered. If the life fits, then the rest can come along as it wishes. Silas nodded, relief moving through his shoulders like warmth. Truth, then, he said. We go tomorrow. I'll put the last of my gear in the wagon. There are 2 hills that argue with the axle. I like to argue back in daylight. Tomorrow, she repeated, and the word went into place inside her where fear had been living without paying rent. Tomorrow sat down, and fear stood up to leave. Independence heard about the plan before noon. News in a small town is a creek. You can dam it or drink from it, but you'll end up wet either way. Most folks reacted the way people do when other people risk happiness. They pretended to be too busy to judge and judged anyway. At the smithy, a man taking a wife up that far, she'll break before the wagon does. At the dressmaker's, a mountain cabin is only romantic until the potatoes run out. At the livery, Ezekiel snorted so loud the Maras perked. You people ever notice how you only predict doom for lives you aren't brave enough to try? By late afternoon, a small knot of men with clean boots and messy consciences gathered under the awning of the dry goods. Sharing one cigarette-like fellowship could be smoked. The Miller boys were there, wearing bruises as if they were medals. With them stood their cousins, faces pinched from too much hunger and too little pride, and a man Martha had never seen before. New hat, old eyes, the sort that knows where trouble sleeps and sells at breakfast. You care to tell me why any of this is my concern? Marshal Avery asked Ezekiel when the liveryman finally had enough of the muttering and went to fetch the law. Because, Ezekiel said, wiping his hands on an honest rag, men who lose fair don't like it. Yesterday they lost fair. Today, they're inventing a better ending with their mouths. You know what follows that? The marshal sighed as if someone had asked him to fix the weather. Avery wasn't a bad man. He was an average one, which is easier be and dangerous to stay. Let's have it plain, he told the boys. Jake Miller spat, then remembered men were watching and wished he hadn't. Blackwood stealing her. We aim to keep the town respectable. Respectable like 3-on-1? Ezekiel said, mild as buttermilk. The new hat man smiled without heat. Ain't the girl indentured? I heard a rumor she owes Mrs. Cartwright room and board she hasn't paid. Contracts have a way of appearing when a woman looks ready to leave. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. We don't do that trick here. The man tipped his hat, like they were discussing rain. Then you're better than most places, friend. But I'll ask the lady myself. He didn't. He went around the corner, where men go when they mean to be brave privately. He came back with confidence sharper than before. He had shaken down the wrong gossip and convinced himself he'd found gold. By supper, Mrs. Cartwright's dining room brimmed with people who were hungrier for a story than stew. Martha served with steady hands. Silas ate in the corner like a boulder eats, without spectacle, doing nothing but being harder to move than it looks. The door swung and the marshal entered with the new hat, and the Miller brood trailing like bad punctuation. Mrs. Cartwright. Avery began, formal because crowds demand a costume. It's been said you've a debt owed that ties the girl to this house. Mrs. Cartwright didn't frown. She reached beneath the counter and set a ledger on the table. So square could have been a sermon. It's also been said peaches grow on the north side of pines. Watch me prove both wrong. She turned pages. Her handwriting marched like a well-trained regiment. Lodging advances, wages earned, meals taken, and meals comped when Martha worked through. At the bottom of the column, a sum so neat you could eat off it. Paid up, she said, tapping the page. She owes me nothing but her good opinion, which I mean to keep by not treating her like stock. The room didn't breathe for a beat. The new hat man stepped closer, peered, and tried not to look thwarted. You're certain? Amen, Martha said, and realized she had not been afraid even once while outside of walls. Fear had been a habit more than a warning. Habits can be unlearned. Warnings will introduce themselves honestly. You don't have to go inviting them. By the time the boarding house pulled them back into the world's orbit, Mrs. Cartwright had an apron tucked like armor and 3 opinions ready, none of which she fired. She looked at their faces and knew the outcome didn't matter, as much as the fact there would be one. Supper's on, she said. Eat before you tell me anything, because news tastes better when a person isn't chewing it dry. They ate. They laughed at nothing worth repeating. They let the heat soak into their coats and go on into their bones. Martha slipped the knife back into her pocket. The ribbon flashed once in lamplight, and then hid because that's how bravery often behaves. When the room settled, Martha took Mrs. Cartwright's hand and turned it palm up. She set the flat box there the way you hand a woman something weightless that weighs plenty. He asked, she said, eyes bright. Not for an answer tonight. For truth when it comes. Mrs. Cartwright looked at Silas as if to swear him in. He nodded once, solemn as a witness. She closed the box and pushed it back across the table. When, she said, not if you answer either way, you'll still have a key to this door and a plate on this table. That's what we do here. Martha's shoulders lifted and lowered like a person who just put down a sack she didn't realize she'd been carrying since girlhood. Thank you, she said. 2 words achingly sufficient. That night, independence exhaled. Not because all had been made right, but because enough had been. A woman had a decision that didn't include fear. A man had offered without owning. A town had inched toward better. The winter had learned the names of 2 people it would not break. If you ever felt a door open in a way that didn't demand you rush through, just stood there patient, letting you choose your step, hold on to that feeling. It knows the way. Certain enough to lay this book on the church altar, if you like. Certain enough to let every woman in this town read every line. Marshal Avery cleared his throat, suddenly remembering he preferred sleep to paperwork. That settles the matter of indenture. As to safety. Safety, Silas said, putting his cup down with a sound that wasn't loud and still quieted the room. If men trouble her, I'll remove the trouble. If storms trouble her, I'll share wood and wall until they pass. If loneliness troubles her, I'll hold my tongue when words don't help and speak when they do. That is the safety I offer. I do not offer chains. He looked at the new hat like a man looks at a sales pitch he isn't buying. Any other questions? No one had one brave enough to live long in his mouth. The marshal lifted his palms like scales agreeing and left with a dignity he could recover. The boys went with fewer opinions than they brought. The stranger tipped his hat and discovered it didn't tip anything back. When the door thudded shut, the room's held breath came out in a shiver of chairs. Mrs. Cartwright flipped the ledger closed and slid it home. "There," she said to no one in particular. "I am tired of men who put women on menus." Later, after the lamps were trimmed low and the last dish sang itself dry in the rack, Martha stood in the quiet kitchen, hands flat on the table, head bowed like prayer without words. Silas didn't disturb the picture. He stood in the doorway and waited until she reclaimed her hands for herself. "I don't like being a spectacle," she said, "and yet there's a kind of rightness when truth stands up in public and doesn't get shoved back down." "Rightness," he agreed. She opened a drawer, set the flat ring box inside, and shut it without hiding. "If we go tomorrow," she said, "we go early, when day is still soft enough to forgive mistakes." "We'll go when you say," he answered, which was a truth and sounded like one. They left before the town could put on its face. Ezekiel brought out a stout bay and a short, steady mule with eyes like old teachers. "The bay's got opinions," he warned. "She'll share most of them on the first hill. After that she'll carry every promise you make without complaint." Mrs. Cartwright tied up a basket with more food than two people can eat unless they're happy. "If you bring my basket home," she said, "fine. If you don't, also fine. There are worse fates for a basket than being needed." A handful of early risers stood under the awning like commas. They didn't say don't go. They said, by the tilt of their heads and the hands they lifted in half waves, something closer to go well. Martha climbed the wagon seat and sat without apology. The boards creaked and then learned her shape. Silas took the reins and set them loose like a man who knows you can guide without dragging. The wagon rolled. The last plank of town knocked once under the wheel like a door someone forgot to lock. Roads are honest. They tell you where they bend and how steep they feel, and what they'll take in return for passage. This one asked the mule to remember that patience is a pace. It asked the bay to trust her feet. It asked Martha to let go of the picture of herself that other people had drawn for her, and let the air rush in where the lines had been. They passed the willow where the preacher baptized folks who needed a second start, and folks who didn't but wanted one. They crossed the flat where boys ran horses when they wanted to feel like gods, and learned instead to feel like men who could fall and get up. They forded the creek, the wheels thinking slowly through the water and coming out wet, which is one kind of blessing. By noon they had climbed the second hill, and the bay had completed her complaints. Silas pulled into a stand of aspen and set the brake. The trees held their coins up to the light and shook them so the sun could count. Martha took bread and cheese from a basket and cut them with the little knife that wore her blue ribbon like a reminder that useful can be beautiful without asking permission. "You're different," Silas said, not as a compliment exactly, more like a man noticing weather and learning how to dress for it. "How so?" "You take the space you need like someone taught you not to apologize for eating." "My mother taught me," she said. "She taught me 100 little ways to practice staying. I didn't know how to use them. I am learning." "Keep learning," he said, and meant, "I like the way the world looks when you do." Afternoon tilted. The horizon sawed itself into mountains. Martha watched the blue layers stack until they stopped being scenery and turned into something her bones recognized. It surprised her, that recognition. Not an ache. A call. Not a map. A welcome. They reached the cabin at a soft hour. The creek told the same joke it had told the day before. It was still funny. The porch took their weight, without reconsidering its purpose. The door swung as if it had been waiting at attention. Inside, the place smelled the way right places do, like what has been touched by care and iron that knows fire in all 4 seasons. Martha set the basket on the table and brushed crumbs into her palm like she was signing a guest book. "Show me the day," she said, and Silas did. He showed her where the sun struck the far wall in winter and the near one in summer. He showed her where the stew pot can sit and be hot without becoming angry. He showed her the low shelf to set books on so they wouldn't die when the door banged. He showed her hooks he'd left empty without knowing why, and a peg she guessed had been waiting for a shawl the color of berries at first frost. They stepped back outside. The yard asked for edges she knew how to draw. "Garden here," she said, pointing, feet already measuring. "Beans with a trellis can borrow strength from the wall. Carrots in the deep loam. Herbs along the stone where the heat makes their minds up." She knelt and pressed her palm into the dirt. When she lifted it, the earth let go like trust does, reluctant then generous. Silas watched. The particular way a man watches the answer to a problem he couldn't name take shape under someone else's hands. "I built the shelter," he said, "but you'll make the home." "We'll make it," she corrected, plain spoken. Equal as work. That night, they ate at the table like it had been waiting for them to occupy it fully. Food tastes different when a room says your name back to you. Silas washed, Martha dried, and the plates went to the shelf like they had learned a new trick. The little knife rested near the lamp, ribbon catching the light, a single bright line that drew the room into a story. When the lamp burned down to honey, when the creek decided to be the loudest thing still talking, Silas pushed back on the table and let silence hold court. He stood, took the flat box on the mantel, and set it down in the center. He didn't open it. He didn't touch it again. "You'll tell me when you know," he said, voice as steady as a fence post. "Until then, the only promise I ask is this. If it's no, say no as clean as you can. I can live with clean." Martha reached out, laid her palm on the lid, not as claim but acknowledgement. "You'll have it clean either way." She slept in the bed because Mrs. Cartwright's dignity traveled with her. He banked the fire and made a pallet by the stove because respect, once invited, insists on a good night's rest. The house memorized both their breaths. Morning was work. Good, simple, new work. They drew water and carried it without turning the carrying into martyrdom. They chopped wood and stacked it so it could be thankful later. They set a line across a corner for drying herbs and a nail under the window where a measuring string could live. They measured shelves. They lost a screw and found it by listening for laughter. They argued amiably about how many hooks is too many. There is no number if you hang only what you use. Around noon, rain shouldered over the ridge with a voice like distance closing. It hit hard and then gentled, the way confessions do. The roof held. The stove purred. The day became an invitation to sit and test the room with quiet. Martha opened the basket and found the rolled parcel Mrs. Cartwright had tucked at the bottom, a length of sturdy cloth, and a paper of pins. She spread the cloth on the table and traced, with chalk and an old coin, the curve for a curtain that would soften the window by the bed without teaching it to hide. She pinned and cut and stitched with a focus that left no room for doubt. Silas watched her hands and thought, some people make shelter. Some people make shelter feel like company. In the lull between one stitch and the next, thunder put an exclamation point on nothing at all. Martha jumped. The involuntary flinch of a girl whose life included more surprises and celebrations. The flinch annoyed her. Enough, she told herself, not stern, just done. Silas pretended not to notice, so that the dignity of her scolding could stand on its own feet. Then, as if the thunder had been a man clearing his throat to ask permission to speak truth, he said what had been waiting on his tongue. "You don't have to earn this place. It doesn't check your pockets for worth before you come in the door." "I know," she said, but she said the way a person says, "I am trying to know, and it will take me a handful of days more." The rain quit like an apology. Sun found a lip of cloud, spilled through the window, and turned the dust into a private galaxy. Martha looked at it for a very long and very small while. She set the curtain aside, wiped her hands, and picked up the box. She opened it and took the ring out. It was heavy enough to be honest, light enough to be worn while washing potatoes. She didn't slide it on. She lay it next to the knife with the ribbon. Tool. Promise. Blue between gold and steel. "Silas," she said. He looked at her with a care that made the room quieter still. "I am not a woman who needs grand. I am a woman who needs true. My yes comes like winter wheat, slow to show, but when it does, it means to feed you." He didn't move toward her. He stood exactly where he had been, because when you have built moments that don't damage, you don't rush the one that won't. "Is this that yes?" "This is the yes that works," she said, and finally slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like something she had been brave enough to admit wanting. Silas had seen death, clean and ugly both, and he had seen mornings that stitched men back together after. He had very rarely seen grace. He saw it now, and his eyes learned how to hold water without spilling. He reached his hand across the table. She met it halfway. There in the middle, a bow with scarred by meals and mended by oil, their hands looked like a contract that doesn't need writing. They didn't set a date. They set chores. A preacher would come through. The law would be satisfied. The vow already had its own weight. The afternoon spread like butter on warm bread. They built a shelf that would keep books from tragedy. They argued about the height and settled on the one that made them both reach just barely. So we stay limber, she laughed. He whittled pegs for the shawl and the ladle and the hat. She tied her ribbon through the knife loop again and threaded another short scrap through a hole in the curtain rod, so the cloth could slide without complaint. Toward evening, voices came up the trail. Not many, not loud. The kind of voices men use when they come honest. Silas stepped out, rifle leaning against a jam like common sense, and saw Marshal Avery with two men behind. One of them the preacher, collar wet from the rain. The marshal took off his hat and held it so the rainwater didn't run into his eyes. "Afternoon," he called. "We're not here for grief. Word runs faster downhill than it climbs. It says you aim to do a thing. We come to see whether it's being done in daylight." "In daylight," Silas said. "Inside, if you'd share it." They did. The preacher shook out his sleeves, and the marshal left his hat by the door. Martha poured coffee because hospitality is how you remind men to be good. The preacher looked at the joined tools on the table, the knife with the blue and the ring with the promise, and smiled like a man who has seen sacraments in stranger places than this. "Your vows can be said now," he offered, "or next time, or never. What your hands have already promised is sufficient. The Lord hears both the said and the kept." His eyes softened. "I count it a privilege to speak over your house when you're ready." "Soon," Martha said, glancing at Silas. "Soon," he echoed. The marshal did an admirable impression of a man who enjoys coffee. "You have any intention of leaving folks mad?" he asked, eyes flicking toward the trail down. "I have every intention," Silas said easily, "of leaving folks with less to talk about than to do." Avery grunted, which is lawman for amen. "Town's quieter since yesterday," he admitted. "Funny what happens when three fools find out their shadows are smaller than they thought." The men left before the light forgot itself. At the door, the preacher turned back, put a hand on the jamb, and said, "May your kitchen always be louder than your pride." Then he winked at Martha like he'd given a good blessing and knew it. Night closed without argument. They ate. They cleaned. They listened to water and wind settle differences. Before sleep, Martha moved the ring once on her finger and felt how the skin warmed under it. She pretended she was considering the weight. In truth, she was memorizing the feeling so she could take it with her into mornings that don't ask whether a thing is earned, only whether you mean to keep it. The next day was not a wedding and still felt married to purpose. He taught her to set snares that respect the animal and the winter both. She taught him to mend without turning cloth into a map of old mistakes. He taught her where the slope keeps its first flowers. She taught him that rosemary smells like patience if you hold it long enough. By week's end, she had a list of supplies they'd return to town for, neat as a prayer. Flour, lamp wicks, needles, seed, 2 more pans that don't try to burn supper. He had a different list: nails, window putty, fresh rope, a second chair so guests didn't feel like obligations, and a scrap of blue cloth for Mrs. Prawl so ribbon wouldn't be rare. They rolled for town on a Thursday, because Thursdays are when people expect less of you and give more freely. On the ridge, as if the land itself wished to hear the words where it could repeat them back if asked, Silas spoke sideways. "I am afraid." "Of what?" Martha asked, not worried, simply attentive. "Of being the man who promises and fails. Not because I mean to fail, but because the world is bigger than a vow." Martha touched the knife ribbon, then the ring. "That is why we made 2 kinds of promises," she said. "One for the heart, one for the hands. When one breaks for a day, the other holds." He breathed like a man who has found he doesn't have to carry the mountain whole, just the part the day asks for. In town, people saw them together, and most of them saw not a spectacle but a shape that made sense the second time you looked. Mrs. Cartwright came from behind her counter and hugged Martha so hard the future squeaked. Ezekiel let out the bay mare with a smug expression horses, where when they claimed and suggested every good idea before you thought it. Mrs. Prawl handed over cloth and a bundle of thread and said, "For your shelf," as if shelves could wear ribbons, and she knew they could. The Miller boys found somewhere else to be and a reason to be there. The new hat man tipped his hat again and discovered he was tipping it at people who didn't need it, which is the fastest way to make a man go find a different town. At dusk, they returned with a wagon full of small futures. Children along the street counted out loud. 1 sack, 2, 3, and a girl with soft braids asked if the lady with the blue ribbon would ever show the garden she made. When spring remembers us, Martha promised, "I'll show anyone who wants to learn." "Me," the girl said instantly. "I want to learn." "Then you will," Martha said, and the girl pocketed the answer like a miracle she could take out when the winter got bossy. Back at the cabin, under a sky stitch full of intent, Martha and Silas put away what they had brought. The shelf accepted the books and asked for more. The pan set itself on its hook and liked it. The lamp wicks lay down like roads, promising light if you fed them. They sat, finally, and counted blessings without getting fancy. "I have a thing to ask," Silas said at last, rubbing the back of his wrist where old scars itch in new weather. "Will you choose a word for this place? Not a name the map needs. A word the house can answer to when storms bang and people come up the trail with their traveling faces." Martha didn't think long. She had been carrying the word since the creek first said hello. "Stay," she said. "Let it be the kind of stay that doesn't trap, the kind that says you may live here as your full self and not get smaller to fit the doorway." He repeated it, tasting it, and nodded. "Stay." He went to the door, opened it to the night, and set it again into the dark so the hill could learn it. The wind said something back that wasn't English and was kind. If you've ever heard a house answer to a word you gave it, you know. That's not superstition. It's craftsmanship. Keep listening. There's more to build, and you'll want both hands free for what's next. The first snow came like a letter with no return address. Sudden, heavy, and full of someone else's business. It found the valley already stacked with kindling, the root cellar lined with jars that caught the stove's light like quiet lanterns, and 2 people had agreed to keep going whenever fear asked them nicely to stop. Martha learned snow by its footsteps. There was the powder that hisses along the porch boards like gossip, the wet kind that slumps off the pine boughs in heavy sighs, and the hard wind-packed slabs that talk back to your boots and demand respect. She made names for each in her head and stored them the way a cook stores spices, so when a day needed a certain understanding, she could reach and season it. Silas taught her the animal paths stitched into the white, the rabbit's quick punctuation, the fox's long grammatical patience, the elk's steady sermons. When you can read these, he said, you don't feel alone. You feel accompanied by things that mind their business and keep you company anyway. They worked, not urgently, smart. With an ice out, Ash carried, door latches checked twice. Martha measured time with the dough that rose true even when the air was bossy, and with the stitches she put into curtains and shirts, each small knot like a promise tied to itself. Silas measured it by the sound of the creek under its glass lid, by how the wind shifted around the ridge when weather bargained with the valley, and by the way fatigue had dazed and tasted clean instead of bitter. On a Tuesday that began in a calm so delicate it felt borrowed, they heard the first far-off freight of something bigger. Wind, not from the usual quarter. A low note that found the eaves and tested every seam in the world. "Blow down day," Silas said, peering into the west where the light wore a bruise. "Drop the poles to the low rack. Bring the Mares in now, even if they don't wanna. Fill every bucket. Tie the chimney cap." They moved like a practice sentence. Martha rounded the bay and the mule with the apple slice bribe they both respected. Silas staked a wind line from barn to cabin, and then another, so you could cross in the teeth of it without stepping into a blind guess. The stove was fed, then fed again. The oil lamps learned exactly where to stand. By noon, the storm shouldered into them properly. Snow went slantwise, hard pellets with temper. The wind took a deep breath and spoke in paragraphs. The cabin leaned, then squared itself. The way a man leans into a load he means to carry without drama. Inside, the list got short and the feelings got simple. Stay warm. Keep flame. Watch for the one mistake that steals 2 hours. They ate stew hot enough to argue with the air. Martha set out strips of cloth near the door to wrap around hems and cuffs for going out. So cold doesn't borrow more of you than you've agreed to lend. Silas grinned. Good sense, braided. Late afternoon, the barn door thudded a complaint no building should make. Silas shouldered into his coat and took the rope. Martha tied him in, not tight, true. He touched the ring on her finger without looking at it and went out into the white. That rope a sentence that said I will come back if you keep reading. Minutes lengthened. The rope tugged once. I am working. Twice. Still working. Then a heavy heave, sudden slack, and the line jumped in her hands. Something had given way. Martha reeled in and got nothing but a frayed end and a blow of wind that felt like a hand shoving a shoulder. She didn't think. She wrapped her own waist with the spare rope, looped it to the porch anchor, and stepped into the storm. The world vanished to 2 feet and a roar. She held the line, measured 3 hand spans, moved, measured again. The barn was a shape in a loud dream. Snow sliced her cheeks. The cold bit her teeth. She found the door off one hinge, slamming. The bay's eyes rolled, whites flashing. The mule stamped, furious and frightened. Silas was there, hat gone, hair ice shot, muscling the door against a wind that wanted to adopt it. Together, without words, they won the argument. Martha wedged a feed bin as a brace. Silas drove a spike with 2 blows that said he didn't want a third. Back! He yelled over the wind. Now! They took the rope and retreated, hand over hand, the line humming the gale like a stringed instrument played by a drunk god. At the porch, Martha stumbled. Her boot failed the top step, and she pitched hard. Silas caught her coat with a snap that would leave a bruise, hauled, and got her through the door. They slammed it through the bar, and they laughed, the shaky kind that lives next to relief. Then they saw it. Blood. Silas's left sleeve had gone dark. Not a showy wound, meaner. A slice from a door strap, deep enough to argue. Martha sat him, cut the coat away, and washed the gash with water she kept warm, because some part of her had been listening to weather all day and brought the basin near. "You gonna stitch me?" he asked, voice somewhere between pleased and resigned. "Not if you faint first," she said, as dry as winter bread. She threaded her heavy needle, cleaned, oiled, respected. She breathed once to steady the shake that rush brings. Then she sewed his skin like she sewed her seams. Small, even, not taking more than necessary, always thinking about how it will move later. Silas watched her hands. "You cheat pain," he said. "You give it exactly its portion, and no extra." "Pain does like seconds," she answered, nodding and trimming. "We will not indulge it." They wrapped the arm, layered him in blankets, poured him a thimble of whiskey, and let the storm work through night while the cabin kept its own respectable hours. When wind finally remembered how to go back where it came from, dawn arrived as if it had nothing to apologize for. Outside, drifts like small houses. A pine down cleanly in the north corner. Trunk lay like a gift that would be sweat later. The sky wore that scour blue that tricks you into thinking cold isn't sharp until it bites you for forgetting. Martha checked the Mares, fed them kindness and hay in equal parts, and returned with news in her face. "Tracks," she said. "Not ours. 2 men on snowshoes. Came up in the storm's belly. Went around. Stood and watched a while. Left." Silas's mouth went into a line a safer man might call concern, and he called purpose. "Which direction?" "Down valley on the far ridge. I'd say crow's kind if I had $1 and like gambling." He tested his arm. "Stiff, usable later." "Not now. We don't follow," he decided. "We fortify and wait for the visit, if it comes. Men who watch like that come away whether stealing is cheaper than earning. We'll adjust our prices." They set the day to work that would matter if men came walking wrong. Silas sighted a rifle and placed spare cartridges where memory could reach without looking. He coached Martha through the Spencer's rhythm again until the muscle in her forearm learned a small endurance. She checked the door bar, then added a peg brace that made the bar's job easier. "Because even strength likes help," she murmured. He smiled into his beard. They ate early. They spoke little. Silence is not fear when it's busy. The men came at not quite noon. 3 of them, Crow in front, scar red against wind-chapped skin. 2 others with the look of men who've learned to let someone else do the thinking, so they have hands free for worse things. Crow stopped out of easy range and grinned like he expected the sky to applaud. "Afternoon," he called, making courtesy spit on its hands and work for him. "Friendliest house in the hills, I hear. Thought we'd visit." Silas stepped to the threshold, put the barrel vertical against the jamb like a walking stick, and leaned on it so friendliness could remain an option that offended no one. "You'll forgive us if we visit with doors," he said. "Cold does get in." Crow's grin sharpened. "Cold and other things. We saw your barn fuss during that blow. Shame, all that feed goes walking when a door misbehaves." "Barn's obedient," Silas replied. "Door's got its temper sorted." "Well," Crow drawled, "we're short on feed and long on winter. Thought, neighborly, you might share and we might, what's the word, compensate." He held up a pouch. Coins chinked. The sound carried like a sermon about lesser gods. Before Silas could answer, Martha stepped to the door and stood just behind him, not hiding, existing where she meant to exist. She looked at Crow like he was a problem on a slate. If you stay in the numbers, you can solve it. If you let the chalk slide into drawings, you'll be angry for no reason. "Compensation," she said, "means equal weight on both pans. What is the weight, Mr. Crow, of you leaving without sniffing around our life again? I'd pay for that with a sack of oats and my leftover patience." The men behind Crow made the mistake men make when they meet a woman's calm that doesn't ask their permission to keep standing. They laughed short. Crow didn't. He was busy choosing. He set the pouch down in the snow and patted it with the toe of his snowshoe, like he was burying a small pet. "We'll come in," he said. "Not a question." "No," Martha said. "Not loud." All spine. Crow shifted, so the scar on his cheek did a thing scars do when they remember how they happened. He took one step. The rifle's barrel ticked sideways half an inch, just enough to be specific about how choices multiply. Crow's eyes flicked to Silas's bandaged sleeve. He smiled as if kindness pleased him. "Storm got you gentle," he said. "Storm got us ready," Silas answered. All at once, and yet not sudden if you've been listening, the forest behind Crow made the sound of men not trying to be quiet anymore. Marshal Avery stepped out first, Ezekiel behind, and 2 others with decent hats and good decisions. The marshal held his hand up in that careful way a man does when he'd like today to end in paperwork and not digging. "You boys always pick the worst moments," Avery said conversationally. "Miller cousins told me yesterday you were whispering around town for a guide. Bad luck for you that they're broke and bad with secrets." Crow's face thinned. He measured 5 men behind him and 2 in a doorway who smelled like they wouldn't miss. He measured the snow's depth, his men's lungs, his own shadow. He discovered math has a way of teaching manners. "We were visiting." He tried again, less grin now. "You visited," Avery said evenly. "Now you can depart. If you leave your pouch where it is, I'll consider a fine paid in advance for my time. If you take it with you, you can consider this me promising to collect double when you run out of winter." Crow held the marshal's gaze a beat too long, then blinked the blink of a man who hates swallowing and does it anyway. "Gentlemen," he told his men, which is what cowards call other cowards when they need to direct them. They turned and labored back the way they came, their snowshoes scribbling a fast retreat. Avery stepped forward, towed the pouch into his hand, waited, and tucked it into his coat like the law had learned to charge interest. "We had other business nearby." He lied kindly. "Thought we'd walked a long way round." "We are obliged," Silas said, and meant it. Ezekiel nodded at Martha with the solemn pride of a man whose team has scored a point he predicted. "You look like someone the Storm tried and failed to boss." "Storm and men both," she returned, and Ezekiel barked a laugh. The marshal shifted his weight. eyes flicking to Silas's arm. "You need a hand with those down pines? We'll trade you coffee and 2 thick slices of yesterday's bread for a saw crew," Martha said briskly, "and a promise you'll come here for stew the next blow, so Mrs. Cartwright doesn't wear her worry out pacing her boards." "Done," Avery said, surprise into sincerity. They cut that afternoon for men and a woman who learned to step clear of falling trunk without making theater of it. They stacked enough to make March nod politely when it came looking for heat. They ate at the table, the room just big enough for all the shoulders and the stories. The preacher's blessing from days before labeled a meal like butter over potatoes. Humble, generous, exactly right. When the men left, the valley felt larger, but not emptier. The kind of larger where your breath goes deeper, because it can. Days braided into one another. Martha's curtain held the morning like an open hand. The shelf carried books and invited more. The shawl peg learned its purpose. The ring found its home in the little clean hollows of dough when she needed, in the cool washes she wrung, in the firm grip on the spencer, when a fox came too close to the hens and changed its mind about mischief. They returned to town twice before the thaw thought about negotiating. The first time to bring back seed and a spool of strong thread. The second time because Mrs. Cartwright sent a boy with a note folded sharp. "Preacher will be snowbound near you tomorrow if you open the door." Martha smiled all afternoon about how good a friend can be at mischief. He came at dusk, cheeks stung pink, eyes bright with a man's honest gratitude for shelter. He stamped snow from his boots on the porch mat she had braided from rags and stories, and he stepped into a room that looked as if it had built itself for this kind of visit. "You said soon," the preacher said, rubbing his hands. "I thought I'd be where soon could find me." "Soon keeps its appointments," Martha replied, and looked at Silas. They stood without staging. No bouquet, no town, a stove that sang low, a creek that said yes in winter's accent, and 2 tools back on the table, steel and gold with blue between them. The preacher spoke words old enough to be trustworthy and short enough to be remembered. They repeated them as if they had invented truth that morning and wanted to see if it would still work at night. "Do you have rings?" he asked at the right place in the small ceremony. "We have one," Martha said, and slid it off to let the moment borrow it. The preacher smiled. "One is enough if it knows its job." Silas took Martha's hand. He didn't tremble. He didn't decorate. "I vow," he said, voice low and even, "to carry without counting, to ask for what I need without asking the cabin to pay for it, to stand between you and weather when that is what love is, and to stand behind you when your strength wants room to move." Martha took his hand. She, too, chose plain, "I vow to feed what we keep alive, to tell you the truth early before it grows teeth, to stand with you against storms without making an altar of our fear, and keep this house a place where both of us can take off our armor and still feel tall." The preacher shut his eyes like a man who loves his work. "Amen," he said simply. "May your quarrels be short and your gratitude long. May your table be louder than your pride. May your door be the kind that says stay to what is good and go to what is not." They signed a book because paper can be a decent witness when there aren't enough people around to clap. The preacher ate stew. He left with Mrs. Cartwright's basket under his arm and a promise to deliver it back with a note that would scandalize a pen into blushing. Married and still themselves, they woke the next morning to a day that didn't care what they had called it. The hens wanted their scratch. The stove wanted wood. The creek wanted to show off where it ran free under the ice. They obliged each want. They added honeys to the list. Honeys that aren't words but looks. Honeys that way hands reach and remember new responsibilities. Late winter did its last mean thing, and then remembered its manners. The snow's crust softened. The pines shook themselves like dogs after a bath. The wind cleared its throat of old arguments and learned a new tune. On a morning where the air pretended it's spring and didn't quite fool them, a sound came up the trail that had no business in that valley. Iron on rock and many holes at once. Silas stepped onto the porch and squinted. Martha came beside him, hand shaded her eyes. Riders. Not crow. These men sat their saddles like work, not swagger. At their head, a woman with her hair in a neat coil under a hat made for town, not mountain. Behind her, a wagon with a shaking tarp, and an axle that had learned regret the hard way. The column stopped in the yard, as if the house had held up a hand. The woman on the lead mare removed her hat, and Martha discovered you can be startled by beauty without envying it. The stranger's face was pale from fever or worry. Her mouth had the press of someone who decided not to break in public. "Forgive the intrusion," the woman said, voice trained to keep steadiness on a stage, and now keeping it for dearer reasons. "I'm Dr. Eliza Hart. We're 2 days out of independence to the new settlement at Elk Fork. We've a woman in the wagon who's gone into labor early." The wheel hit a rock, and, well, the country decided to be country. Martha didn't look at Silas to ask permission. Her house already knew its job. "Bring her in," she said, and the room changed shape around the need without moving an inch. In minutes, the wagon's load was their load. A young wife, face slick with pain, breath too quick, eyes too wide. Her husband white to the lips, but willing. Dr. Hart opened her case with the competence of a woman who has had to out competent men to be allowed to practice, and Martha laid a clean sheet on the bed that had been waiting for this without telling anyone. Hot water, clean towels, a light where the light needs to be, Dr. Hart said, and Martha heard in the orders an echo of her own kitchen voice. She moved before the doctor finished thinking, hands already there with the next thing. Silas cleared the porch, saw to the horses, kept men out who wanted to help with their talking, and sat the husband by the stove with a cup he didn't deserve to hold, but did. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is hold your breath where a woman tells you to. The labor was hard. Harder than Martha had words for. Hard in that ancient way that makes even men in the yard quieter. Dr. Hart's hands were precise and gentle, and does not care if you like me about their work. Martha's hands held, wiped, steadied, encouraged. She spoke into the other woman's ear timetables made of breath. In and down, in and down. You are a river. You are stronger than this minute. This minute knows it. Teach your body the same. Hours slid. The house learned a new kind of silence, one with a cry hovering just outside it like a bird that doesn't know where to land yet. Then a sound broke the hold, the keen of a first human complaint, full of outrage and lung. Dr. Hart laughed one bright note that cut through every ache in the room. "Girl," she said, as if she was announcing weather. "Stubborn. Excellent." Martha wept and didn't say why. The mother wept for reasons older than rope. The husband dropped to his knees in a posture he'd never struck for any god, but now made sense. Silas stayed on the far side of the curtain he'd rigged and pressed his palms to his eyes because some prayers are for men to say in private. They washed, wrapped, and rested. Dr. Hart stitched the smallest necessary stitches with a speed that was mercy. Martha made broth that tasted like gratitude and salt. Night slid in quietly, sat with them, and didn't ask for a place setting. When the baby was sleeping and the mother had gone to that stunned place good exhaustion grants, Dr. Hart found Martha at the table with her head briefly in her hands, ring glinting in lamplight like a little moon that tells you what time it is inside yourself. "You have a surgeon's steadiness," Dr. Hart said softly, and a midwife's voice. "Where did you learn that?" "From women I watched take less credit than they'd earned," Martha answered, straightening. "And from a need that walks to your door and doesn't care whether you've been paid in training." Dr. Hart smiled in that sidewise way tired people do when they're glad to find another grown soul. Elk Fork could use hands like yours. Independence could, too. I don't say leave. I say come when you wish. I'll write your name where it can be found when pain travels the road looking for help. Write the house's word, Martha said, and Dr. Hart cocked her head. "Stay," Martha said, then add, "comes when called." Dr. Hart nodded, pleased. "You understand my language." At dawn, with the road crusted and forgiving, the wagon turned back toward independence. Elk Fork would have to wait for its new life a handful of days. Silas hitched a bay and rode point, breaking trail to the ridge. Dr. Hart took the rear, eyes everywhere. Martha walked beside the wheel to steady the new father's shaking optimism. When town gathered at the sight of the unlikely procession, the story ran ahead like a dog that knows the way home. Mrs. Cartwright came bareheaded and scolding and already crying. Marshal Avery took hats off men who forgot and put them into their hands to teach them how. The The preacher laughed out loud when he saw the baby's fist raised at the world. Ezekiel lifted his chin at Martha as she passed. "Look at you," he said, "making the mountain more than a place for weather." "Look at us," she returned, and meant all of them. Back in the valley that evening, the house felt different again and exactly the same. They ate bread spread with the last jar of preserves from the bottom shelf, the jar you save for finishing something that matters. Silas leaned back and closed his eyes with the shameless relief of a man who has been useful the right way for 2 days in a row. "You know," he said, eyelids still down, "a thing I used to love about the mountains was how simple they made the math. Cold in, without, hunger in, stew out. I thought people complicated the ledger. Turns out the ledger just gets bigger. The numbers still balance. If you put enough good on the table holds." Martha touched the ring. "Habit now, not doubt. Tomorrow I'll write to Mrs. Cartwright," she said. "I'll tell her the preacher earned his supper. I'll tell her the marshal drank 3 cups without complaining. I'll tell her a doctor came up our trail like Grace with medical bag and an opinion about men." "What will you ask her for?" Silas asked, knowing letters ought to carry a little wanting. "Seed she has and won't miss. And news about the girl with the soft braids, if she still wants to learn the garden come spring." They slept deeper than tired and woke to a morning that smelled like sawdust and bread and a little blue ribbon that had fallen onto the table and waited all night to be tied back where it belonged. At the edge of the clearing, coyote prints meandered without malice. A hawk stitched shadow across the snow. The creek told the joke the same way again, and they laughed anyway. If you've ever watched a house change shape around whatever love brings to its door, you already know what Part 5 is about. Come along. You'll want to hear how this valley remembers favors and how a word like stay can travel farther than a map can mark. By the time the creek let go of its winter grammar and began speaking in quicksilver syllables, the valley had a new habit: other people's footsteps. Not many, just enough to prove that a door can be generous without becoming a revolving one. A trapper with a split knuckle. A family with a mule that had more opinions than sense. A traveling teacher with a busted axle and a lesson plan that included doing sums at a kitchen table while stew simmered within answering distance. Each left lighter than they came, and the house learned the quiet pride of a place that earns its own reputation without bragging. Martha planted early, ignoring the calendar and trusting the soil's warm breath through her palms. She tucked peas beside willow switches, onions into straight, proud rows, and a little square of chamomile near the porch where it could eavesdrop and forgive everyone. She set aside one bed for volunteers, the seeds the wind smuggles and the birds deliver without postage. "Some gifts you plan," she said, "some you practice being ready to receive." Silas rebuilt the fence at the east edge, raising the rails half a hand for the elk that insisted on the shortcut. "If you can't stop a traveler," he said, "make the crossing decent and you'll both be happier." He stalked the ridge at dawn and came home with stories. A bear sow teaching cubs the etiquette of fallen logs, a lone wolf drawing constellations in the duff no human chart had yet named, a young hawk failing gorgeously and trying again until the try became flight. They went to town when town made sense, and stayed away when staying away was respect. Mrs. Cartwright had taken to writing letters that were half news and half recipes. Marshal Avery sent a single page that read, "Crow and companions relocated beyond my patience and the county line. Consider handled." Ezekiel enclosed a scrap of ribbon from the baby's naming day and a pencil sketch of the preacher asleep in a chair with soup dried on his lapel. Dr. Eliza Hart posted a note, "Consulting day, 2nd Saturday each month. Bring the valley if the valley allows it." Martha pinned that one by the shelf like a promise you keep in plain sight, so you can see yourself keeping it. On the first true warm afternoon, the girl with the soft braids, Hannah, arrived on foot with a sack of saved seeds, 3 questions about canning lids, and a look on her face that said she had walked the idea of turning back twice and kept going anyway. Martha put a trowel in her hand. "You want to write your name where the beans can read it," she said. "Plants remember who kneels beside them." They worked the bed until their backs made the good ache, and their talk found that clean, practical channel women share, when work gives the word something to sit on. Hannah's laugh came easy. Her anger came honest. She told a foreman who kept counting her worth in half portions, and of the day she decided to stop letting his math do her thinking for her. So I walked, she said, pushing soil over seed the way you tuck a child into certainty. And here I am, asking to learn the names of green things that have no gossip attached. You'll get gossip anyway, Martha smiled. It's what neighbors do when they can't help you fix a fence. But I find gossip calms down when you give it a basket and work to carry. Silas returned from the ridge at dusk with news that had the shape of fate, but not its teeth. A wagon train camped by the second bend. 2 children with scarlet cheeks and glassy eyes, fever riding them like a hard winter. He set his hat on the peg with careful hands. They need a doctor, he said. They need Eliza. The problem with urgency in the mountains is that it doesn't care for clocks. You ride anyway. They did. Silas took the bay. Martha rode the sorrel, Hannah the mule, who tolerated her like a saint tolerates loud saints. They reached the bend with dark learning the edges. 2 children burned in a circle of worried adults. Martha went soft and specific at once, the way a good hand does when it touches trouble. Cool cloths. Air moving, not draft. Water, not too much, not too fast. Honey in the cup. Talk to them, she told the mothers who had run out of useful things to hold. Use their names like you're stitching them to the side of breathing. Silas went the other way, down trail with a lantern to cut the night into doable pieces. He met Dr. Hart halfway, boots muddy, breath as steady as if she'd been waiting all day to be exactly where she was. She didn't waste courtesy on the dark. Thank you, she said as they turned, which in her profession counted as a hymn. Through the hours that teach humility, they worked. Eliza released heat with a blade's quick mercy, and Martha stood at shoulders and spoke ordinary sentences made of thread. You are safe here. We will not let go. The hardest minute is this one. Once you pass it, we'll be there for next. Hannah ran the errands that stitch a vigil together. More water, more wood, the blanket that holds just enough weight to tell a body its borders. By dawn, the fever broke the way a wave breaks. Sudden, and then all at once obvious that of course it was coming. The children slept, damp and heavy and good. Mothers folded and wept. Fathers forgot to be stone. Dr. Hart leaned against a wagon wheel and shut her eyes with the authority of a woman who has earned the power to borrow 10 minutes. Martha wrapped a shawl around her without making a mystery of it. You keep turning your house into a hospital, Eliza murmured, eyes still shut. You know what that makes you? Sticky with soup and stubbornness, Martha said. Eliza opened one eye. Useful. It makes you useful, and that is the best kind of famous. She rested a beat more, then straightened. Come Saturday, she added, bring anyone who wants to be taught how to do what we just did without me. We'll make the county less afraid one basin at a time. They saw the train to the next safe camp and returned to the valley where everything they owned was exactly where they'd left it. Because you can also be rich that way. They slept a long, honest sleep that follows giving the day everything and finding there was still a little of you left. When the river ran fat and black with snowmelt, a jaunty notice rode into the valley in the pocket of a boy too pleased with his errand. Spring fare, music, bread, barter, and a thanks given properly for winter favors rendered. Signed, more or less, by everyone. Cartwright, Avery, Hartthorne, Reverend Mills, back from Rounders, plus the schoolteacher who wrote like she hoped the letters themselves would bring more people. Martha read it twice and smiled like someone hearing her name sung in the next room. We should go, she said. Silas nodded. We should wear the shirt with the good buttons, he deadpanned. She slapped his arm gently, the way you slap dough to remind it who's in charge. The fair looked like the town had taken everything useful outside and added fiddles. Pies lined up like patient saints. Quilts unfurled on ropes like boats learning to sail on dry land. A table of used books with prices that proved the seller wanted them to go to houses that would read them and not star remind them. Children with blue sticky mouths. Dogs with high opinions of crumbs. Mrs. Cartwright came at Martha with an embrace that put the word dear into bone and not just air. Marshal Avery shook Silas's hand with that up and down that stands in for things men won't say where there are pies. Dr. Hart kissed both their cheeks and then threatened to inoculate the entire fair if anyone interrupted her pastry. Ezekiel pressed a wrapped parcel into Martha's hand and muttered, "Don't argue." It was a proper kitchen knife, balanced like a thought that's already true. Sometime past noon, the preacher stepped onto a crate and cleared his throat in a key that made people turn even if they were halfway through a cinnamon roll. "I've words," he began, which drew a collective, polite groan because of course he did. He smiled like a man you forgive before the fact. "Short ones," he added. The groan transmuted into laughter. He spoke of winter and neighbors, of rope lines and bread lines, of doors that stayed closed against storm and open to people. He said thank you out loud to a list so long it turned into a hymn, and nobody clapped in the middle. He named Silas and Martha last, which is a preacher's way of making last sound like anchor. His final words are the kind that sit down beside you later and keep you company. May we keep being the place where a no to cruelty becomes a yes to each other. The fiddle took it from there. Avery danced so stiffly and so joyfully at once that 2 small children adopted him as a moving landmark. Mrs. Cartwright waltzed like grammar. No mistakes, all music. Dr. Hart refused twice and then accepted once and made the accepting look like strategy. Silas and Martha stood at the edge not because they were shy, but because they were thinking about stepping in. He held out his hand. She set hers in it. They looked at each other like a question that has already heard the answer and still enjoys the asking. They did not glide. They did not float. They moved like 2 people who work for a living and bring their balance home with them. It was lovely. It was honest. It was theirs. No one laughed. A few cried. A boy with jam on his cheek pointed and said, "That is how you carry wood, without dropping it." And his father nodded solemnly, strangely proud. On the far side of the square, 3 men watched, older now by half a winter and a little shame. The Miller brothers, who had once found cruelty entertaining, and then discovered it cost them friends. The youngest stepped forward before the other 2 could talk him out of his better self. "Ma'am," he said to Martha when the tune ended, "we've said sorry before with our hats, but not with our mouths. We were wrong. Thank you for not making us pay forever. People like us need a little change to be worth the feeding." Martha regarded him the way a gardener regards a plant that has finally decided what it wants to be. "Then keep changing," she said. "Make it somebody else's good news." The boy smiled the crooked smile of a man who will spend the next season proving it to himself as much as to anyone else. By late afternoon, the fair had traded enough stories to tide it through another year. Ezekiel auctioned a horse at a fair price on purpose, and snarled at anyone who tried to overpay just to make a scene. The teacher found 3 children who counted better when someone let them move their hands while they thought. Mrs. Cartwright pressed 2 jars of preserves into Martha's bag and acted offended when Martha offered coin. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "I'm building an economy of thank yous, and you will not crash my market." Silas bought a new whetstone because it whistled when he breathed on it. Good omen. And a spool of blue thread because he liked the way it looked against Martha's dress. He tucked it into her palm without making meaning of it. She made the meaning anyway and kissed the corner of his mouth, so quickly that only 3 people saw, and 2 of them were delighted, and the third pretended to be scandalized for sport. They walked home in the blue hour, when the world forgets how to choose between day and night and decides to wear both. The valley received them with that slight, indulgent creak a house makes when it is pleased to have its people back. The hens muttered about neglect. The stove acquiesced aflame. The porch took their dust like a secret. Summer worked its steady magic. Hannah came and went, learning, leaving, bringing, becoming. News traveled like the creek does, constant, sometimes louder. Dr. Hart's Saturday clinics grew until she had to borrow the church, and then the livery, and finally the meadow itself. She gave Martha a tin of instruments wrapped in oilcloth and a sentence worth more than any certificate. "You're welcome wherever I put these to work." The map of their life became a comfort. Ridge, garden, town, clinic, home. Then new lines appeared, penciled first, then inked. A little ledger on the shelf with names under helped, and helped us with arrows going both ways until the categories learned to overlap. A bigger root cellar because winter is greedy and we intend to feed it with our own hands. A second chair by the window because watching the same sunrise from 2 angles makes the day more true. One evening in late August, when the beans clicked dry on their vines like smart fingernails and the hawks taught their young to argue with gravity and win, Martha set a loaf on the table and sat very still. Silas looked up, instantly less hungry for bread than for whatever the stillness was guarding. She took his hand and turned it palm up, not like a fortune-teller, but like a woman who intends to write something there with the smallest of gestures. "We may need a crib," she said. The words were soft, but they landed with conserved force of a season of secrets. He blinked. He smiled, small at first, as if he didn't want to scare the happiness, and then broad, because that's how men smile when the mountain. They moved steps politely out of the way. He stood and put his forehead against hers and said nothing for a while, because sometimes the most eloquent prayer is breathing in the same rhythm. They built the crib a week later, sanded it until it was a lesson in patience, rubbed it with oil the way you rub a truth until it shines. Martha lined it with a scrap of quilt Mrs. Cartwright had insisted was too worn for guests and perfect for love. Silas hung a little string of blue thread above it, because color enjoys being invited. Autumn returned politely, as if it had learned manners since last year. The aspen put on their coins and gave them away for free. The air found its edge. People came by with apples and advice. Dr. Hart came with a bag heavy and a smile light. "You know the work," she said to Martha in the doorway. "But I'll take the lintels and the thresholds and the befores and afters so you can keep your hands for what only you can do." The night came like a promise being kept. It held. It asked. It lasted as long as important things take. Martha did the work every mother does with whatever tools she can find. Breath and bravery, and a body that says yes to a demand beyond explaining. Silas did the work every good man does in such a room. Made himself into furniture that steadies and a voice that knows when to be quiet. Eliza kept time with her hands and her kind cruelty. The way a river keeps time by insisting it is a river. When the cry came, it rearranged the house's bones. It rearranged the valley's weather. It rearranged Silas's face into something a boy might recognize in a man. He would have become of grief, had not put its finger there all those years ago. A daughter, dark hair, serious mouth, fists like punctuation. Martha wept, the happy kind, and the thank you for letting me arrive kind. Silas spoke her name the way a man speaks the first word he ever learned how to say as if it belonged to him. They named her Claire for the light she carried into a room, for the way clarity feels like cold creek water on a tired throat. For Martha's mother, whose Bible still held a pressed flower that had survived 5 houses to get here. The preacher arrived in mourning with coffee and a blessing, and cried in the doorway, and pretended the steam had done it. Mrs. Cartwright sat on the edge of the bed, and taught the baby to hold a finger, and taught Silas to hold a baby, without acting like he was apologizing to it. Hannah brought a basket of green beans, and a look that said, "I see my own road from here, and it is not small." Dr. Hart wrote in her little book. Claire Blackwood, born of a room that had learned the word stay and taught it to us again. Winter heard about the baby and decided to be beautiful about it instead of cruel, at least at first. The fire burned in its exact measure. The kettle sang in 3 keys and did not show off. They slept in sets of 2 hours, which is how horses and saints sleep. Silas walked the rooms with Claire against his chest, humming songs he didn't know he knew. Martha learned a new ledger, ounces and naps, smiles that arrived like weather fronts. The valley adjusted its hum to include one more voice. And because stories like beginning again, the town wrote another notice when the snow decided to get serious. Harvest feast restored after winter's gone mean. Music, meat, pies, and a welcome for the valley folk who taught us how to be neighbors. There was a line at the bottom, different ink, unmistakable hand. "Please come. Bring the baby. Eliza." They went. The square had dressed the same as always and better than before. Lanterns on ropes made constellations you could reach. Tables bent under the weight of gratitude disguised as calories. Ezekiel carved with the solemnity of a priest. Avery poured cider like a man deputized by thirst. The preacher told a story so short it made Mrs. Cartwright suspicious. At the far end, a little hush, the kind that respects fear without feeding it. The boys from first day, the ones with jokes for weapons, stood straighter now, cleaner. The youngest, already changed once, had changed again. His arm held a girl's arm who held a ring in her eyes and a wedding date in her pocket. He stepped forward when he saw Silas and Martha and the small bundle whose noise made old men grin. "Ma'am," he said, voice finding a registered truth he'd been practicing. "This is June. We made apologies with work this year. Fixed fences without being asked. Hauled water when Mrs. Cartwright's pump got stubborn. Stood between trouble and folks smaller than we are. I'm not saying we're saints. I'm saying we remember." He looked at Claire and forgot to be eloquent. She's proof," he finished, helpless and right. Martha touched his sleeve. "Keep your hands to that work," she said. "It's the only kind that pays interest you'll want." They ate and were fed by more than food. They danced again and were steadier at it. They told the kind of jokes that don't find a throat at someone else's expense. And at some point between songs and pie, the preacher climbed onto the crate one more time and raised a hand, and didn't have to clear his throat, because the town was already listening. "Every year we say harvest like a magic word," he said. "What if we say what we mean? We gather what we planted, and also what we didn't. We gathered courage planted by strangers. We gathered the habit of showing up. We gathered a baby's cry, which is a sound a future makes when it insists on being invited. And we gathered a new rule: leave no one in the cold just because the weather outside your own door is fine." No one clapped. Everyone breathed. It felt like the valley had grown lungs. Long after, when the jars on the shelf wore their labels like little flags of summer, when the stove told its winter stories and the windows put their frost jewels on the ledges for display, when Claire slept between them like a treaty, Silas said into the warm dark, "There's a kind of map I never knew I needed. It doesn't show mountains. It shows where we promised things and then kept the promise." Martha, awake in the useful way mothers are, traced a line on his forearm with her finger. Door, creek, clinic, town, home, cradle, table. "We'll keep drawing it," she said, "with breadcrumbs and footpaths, with names written in pencil, and then ink, with that word on the lintel. Stay," he whispered, "because saying out loud is how you teach a house to answer." Outside, snow began without sound, the generous kind, a blanket with good intentions. Somewhere down valley, a lantern moved. Somewhere upridge, a fox considered a chicken and thought better of it. Inside, the big clock that wasn't clock, fire, breath, small feet kicking the air, kept time with what mattered. If you've carried any part of this story with you to hear, you already know the invitation hidden in its pockets. It isn't loud. It isn't even word some nights. It's the way your own door feels in your hand when you choose to open it. It's the quiet habit of adding a chair. It's the small courage of saying no where cruelty expects a crowd, and yes, where one kindness can teach a street to behave. And if some part of you is drawing a map no one else can see yet, keep drawing. The roads that matter don't wait for permission, only companions. If a porch light has ever felt like a promise to you, you know why this tale wanted one more minute. Thank you for walking it with us. When you hear a story like this in the wild, pass it on. The world keeps warm that way.